Shocking DNA discovery. This black man's DNA proves that 99.99% black genes are so unique.
They told us black people came to America in chains, that we were stolen from Africa, stripped of everything and dumped into a new world we didn't belong to. But what if I told you that's the biggest lie ever told? Because one black man's DNA just destroyed that narrative. His name was Albert Perry, and when scientists tested his Y chromosome, they found something terrifying. It was older than every known human being on Earth. Not just African, not just American, not even Neanderthal. His DNA didn't just connect him to the first man. It proved black men were here in America before native tribes, before Columbus, before anyone. And the moment they realized this, they went silent. Because if black men were the first humans and the first Americans, then everything you were taught about history, race, and power is a lie. History isn't written by the truthful. It's written by the powerful. And for centuries, the truth about black people in America, who we were before slavery, before colonization, before the whip and the auction block, was systematically erased. From the moment the first ships docked, white colonizers didn't just steal bodies. They stole stories, cultures, tongues, bloodlines, and they replaced them with a single narrative. You came from nothing. You were brought here like cargo. You have no past, no land, no legacy. But that narrative was never meant to be true. It was meant to control. Because if black people in America ever knew who we really were, if we ever realized we didn't just arrive here in chains, but that we were already here, thriving, ruling, building, the world would never look at us the same again. That's why early scientists avoided studying African-American DNA in depth. They studied European lineages, Asian migrations, even Siberian ancestry. But they stayed away from the one group whose blood carried the real story, the one they couldn't afford to explain, African Americans. Because deep down they knew, if they cracked open our chromosomes, they'd find a story that didn't begin on a plantation. They'd find kingdoms, migrations, ancient power. And in 2013, when a team of stunned geneticists ran a test on the DNA of a quiet, ordinary man from South Carolina, they accidentally opened that buried door. And what they saw on the other side, it changed everything. Albert Perry wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a historian. He didn't publish papers, lecture at universities, or make headlines in his lifetime. In fact, Albert Perry lived a quiet life in South Carolina, just one of millions of African Americans whose family history had been shattered by slavery, lost to the records, and swallowed by time. But what Albert didn't know, what no one knew, was that he was carrying a secret in his blood, a code older than civilization itself. After his death, one of his relatives submitted his DNA to a commercial ancestry company. It was supposed to be routine, just another family tree search like so many others. But what scientists discovered in Albert Perry's Y chromosome, the strand of DNA passed down directly from father to son, left them speechless. It didn't match any known lineage in modern humans, not European, not Asian, not even African lineages previously recorded. In fact, it didn't match anything. Albert Perry's Y chromosome was so ancient, so genetically distinct, that it predated the oldest known Y chromosome ever found in a human being. We're not talking hundreds of years, or thousands. We're talking over 338,000 years old. Let that sink in. This man's paternal lineage was walking the earth before the first modern humans even appeared in East Africa, before the migration out of Africa, before Homo sapiens were fully formed. This meant only one thing. Albert Perry's Y chromosome came from a lineage that branched off long before anyone ever thought possible. A lineage that may have never left Africa, or worse, one that left Africa and came to America first. It shattered the timeline. It broke the tree of human ancestry. And suddenly, the idea that African Americans were just descendants of enslaved Africans collapsed. Because if Albert Perry's Y chromosome wasn't just African, but older than humanity itself, then the African American story isn't just about bondage, it's about origin. Albert Perry became the glitch in the matrix of Western science, the walking proof that the story of man didn't start in caves in Europe, it started in blackness, it started in us, and the world hasn't been the same since. The Y chromosome is a special kind of story. It's passed down, unchanged, from father to son for generations, like a genetic scroll etched in blood that never forgets. And Albert Perry's scroll told a story no one was ready to hear. When researchers at a commercial DNA lab ran his sample, alarms went off. His Y chromosome didn't align with anything in their global databases. It didn't match known African haplogroups. It didn't align with the widely accepted migration out of Africa. It didn't even show signs of the common mutations found in ancient human DNA. It was alien. It turned out that Albert Perry carried a Y chromosomal lineage that was over 338,000 years old. That's older than the oldest anatomically modern human fossils ever found. Think about that. His DNA is so ancient, it predates Homo sapiens. It predates Neanderthals. It predates everything we've been taught in biology class. According to mainstream science, the Y chromosome of modern humans should trace back to a common ancestor who lived around 200,000 years ago, often called Y chromosomal Adam. But Perry's DNA shattered that narrative, because his Y chromosome wasn't a branch from the tree of modern humans. It was a separate tree entirely, a tree so old it suggested that the human story was either far older than we thought, or that another previously unknown lineage had existed right alongside us, a forgotten branch of the human family. Now here's where it gets even more explosive. When scientists compared Perry's Y DNA markers with other ancient samples, some found in isolated tribes of Africa, some from early human remains in the Americas, they found fragments of similarity. In certain Native American burial sites, especially in parts of South Carolina, Georgia, and Mexico, researchers have found ancient remains with genetic signatures that mirror rare African lineages. Could it be a coincidence, or could Albert Perry's ancient DNA be a living link to an erased population, one that existed in both Africa and the Americas long before the textbooks say people crossed the Bering Strait? That's when the whispers started. If Perry's chromosome predated the so-called first Americans, and if his DNA resembled markers found in ancient American bones, then someone had to ask, were black people the first Americans too? Not migrants, not slaves, but originators. And that single possibility was enough to shake the foundation of anthropology, archaeology, and everything we thought we knew about the peopling of the Americas. So what did they do? They buried it in obscure journals. They called it an anomaly. They labeled it an outlier. But it's not an outlier when it happens again, and again, and again. Albert Perry wasn't the glitch, he was the key. Albert Perry's Y chromosome didn't just whisper from the past, it screamed. Because when you line up his ancient paternal DNA with historical records, oral traditions, and archaeological findings across the Americas, a haunting truth begins to take shape. Black people weren't just in America before Columbus. They were here before the so-called Native Americans we see in textbooks, before the Bering Strait, before history began being edited. And the proof? It's everywhere, if you know where to look. Let's start with the Olmecs. Mainstream historians say the Olmec civilization in Mexico is one of the oldest in the Americas, known for its colossal stone heads with thick lips, wide noses, and unmistakably African features. For decades, scholars have tried to dismiss it as is stylistic. But what if those statues were not art? What if they were portraits? Portraits of the black indigenous rulers who walked these lands before the Aztecs, the Mayans, or the Incas. Then there's the Washita Nation, a little-known group of black Native Americans who claim to be the oldest continuous civilization in North America. They built mound cities, established trade networks, and lived across the Mississippi Valley long before any Europeans ever touched the soil. Their land was rich with temples, pyramids, and a culture of deep spiritual science, eerily similar to ancient African civilizations. And guess where Albert Perry was from? South Carolina, a region once heavily occupied by the Yamasee, another black Native American tribe that mysteriously disappeared from history after resisting colonization. Many Yamasee were enslaved, not as Africans, but as indigenous people. Their records erased, their tribes absorbed, their bloodlines renamed. But DNA doesn't lie. When you trace the unique ancient Y-DNA markers in African Americans today, particularly those from South Carolina, Georgia, and the Deep South, you'll find genetic fingerprints that match pre-Columbian America and Albert Perry's Y chromosome. It fits the pattern. It's as if his DNA was a survivor of a genocide, not just of people, but of memory itself. They tried to tell us we arrived on ships, but the ruins tell another story. The statues speak another language, and the blood still remembers. We built cities. We held ceremonies under the stars. We governed complex societies that spanned from the Mississippi to the Yucatan. And when European colonizers arrived, what did they say in their journals? They described meeting black Indians, dark-skinned natives, and Negroid peoples living among the tribes. It was documented, then deleted. Why? Because it shattered the colonial justification that the land was empty. It proved that black people not only belonged to this land, we helped birth it. So when scientists found Albert Perry's Y chromosome, ancient, untouched, impossible to categorize, it wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was the ghost of a nation returning through the bloodline. And suddenly the question wasn't just who was Albert Perry, but who were we before they rewrote our story? If Albert Perry's DNA could talk, it would say one thing: I was here before it all. Because his Y chromosome, over 338,000 years old, didn't just place him before Native Americans, before Europeans, before all recorded history. It placed him at the very beginning of humanity. Modern science confirms what ancient traditions have long whispered, that Africa is the birthplace of mankind. But what they rarely mention is this: the first humans were not just African. They were black, and not just any black, but genetically closer to today's African Americans than any other group alive. Albert Perry's Y chromosome is what scientists call basal, meaning it sits at the root of the human family tree. It doesn't descend from anything we know, it precedes it. And while most people believe humanity slowly walked out of Africa into Europe and Asia, Perry's lineage suggests something far more powerful and dangerous to the narrative. Because DNA doesn't move alone. It migrates with people. And ancient black people didn't just migrate. They explored. There is growing evidence that ancient seafarers from Africa reached the shores of the Americas long before Columbus ever dreamed of a voyage. We're talking thousands, even tens of thousands, of years earlier. The ancient Egyptian texts that describe lands to the west, the African ships found buried off the Brazilian coast, the pre-Columbian artifacts in Mexico and the Mississippi that mirror African spiritual symbols. All of it points to a black presence in the Americas that predates the very concept of native and completely erases the lie that we were only brought here in chains. So where does Albert Perry fit in? Simple. His DNA is the smoking gun, because his Y chromosome, untouched, undiluted, ancient beyond belief, was found not in Africa, but in South Carolina. Let that sink in. A 338,000-year-old African genetic marker sitting quietly in the veins of a black man in America. What are the odds? Unless his ancestors were already here. Unless they were among the first to carry the fire of civilization across the sea. Unless black people didn't just come from Africa. We carried Africa with us, to Asia, to Australia, to the Pacific Islands, to South America, and yes, to North America. We weren't scattered slaves. We were original explorers, spiritual scientists, earth architects. And the fact that this truth lives in Albert Perry's DNA, in your DNA, means you are not an afterthought of history. You are its source code. You are living proof of a migration, a mastery, and a memory that predates every border, every book, and every colonial lie ever told. And no matter how many times they try to erase it, the blood remembers. If Albert Perry had been a European man, his face would be on the cover of every history book. His DNA would be called a miracle of science. There would be documentaries, Nobel Prizes, museum exhibits. Instead, silence. Because when the results of his DNA came in, showing a Y chromosome more ancient than all modern humans, the reaction wasn't celebration. It was fear. The scientists were stunned. They double-checked, then triple-checked, and once they realized what they had, they buried it. No press release, no media tour, just a quiet research paper in a journal most people have never heard of. Why? Because Albert Perry's DNA wasn't just science. It was revolutionary truth. It threatened the very foundation of Western historical narratives. Narratives designed to elevate some, erase others, and justify centuries of conquest, colonization, and enslavement. Think about it. If black men were here before anyone else, if we were the first humans, if we were the first Americans, then the entire story of civilization, as told by textbooks, Hollywood, and governments, falls apart. It means we weren't just stolen from Africa. We were stolen from America too. It means African Americans are not simply the descendants of slaves, but the descendants of ancient kings, architects, and navigators whose blood still holds the map of humanity. And that kind of truth? It terrifies those in power. Because truth leads to questions. Questions lead to research. Research leads to proof. And proof leads to accountability. Imagine what would happen if millions of African Americans realized that their roots in this land went deeper than Plymouth Rock, deeper than Native American treaties, deeper than European discovery, that their DNA didn't make them guests, it made them founders. Imagine the land claims, the cultural rights, the reparations, the education demands. Everything the system has built, on the lie that we were only brought here, begins to crumble the moment the truth comes out. So instead of confronting the discovery, they dismissed it. They called Albert Perry's DNA an anomaly. They said it was genetic noise. They locked it behind academic paywalls, published in sterile language only experts could decode. But here's what they didn't count on: that the internet would remember, that the people would dig, that this truth, once uncovered, would spread like wildfire, because it only takes one spark, one man, one Y chromosome older than human memory. And suddenly, the world has to explain why everything we've been taught was a lie. Albert Perry's DNA wasn't just a discovery. It was a revolution in our blood, and no institution, no university, no government can suppress that forever. Albert Perry didn't know he was carrying the oldest Y chromosome on Earth. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a quiet man from South Carolina. But what made him powerful wasn't his fame. It was his blood. Because that ancient genetic code, the one that stunned scientists and rewrote history, wasn't just his alone. It was a spark passed down through generations, from father to son, from ancestor to descendant, across oceans, across continents, across time. And here's the truth. No one wants to say out loud, if Albert Perry had it, so could you. If you're African American, your DNA may carry the very same ancient markers, echoes of a time before time, of ancestors who weren't enslaved but sovereign, builders, navigators, and spiritual scientists. You may be walking around with the world's oldest story encoded inside of you. Think about that. You're not a broken branch of a stolen people. You're a living archive. You carry not just trauma, but origin. Not just survival, but supremacy of memory. Not just pain, but proof. Proof that black people are not defined by slavery, but by legacy. And that legacy wasn't born in chains. It was born in the beginning, before pyramids, before continents split, before the names African or American ever existed. We were already here, the same blood that carved kingdoms into the Sahara, that built mound cities in Mississippi, that crossed the Atlantic before Columbus ever left his shore, still flows in you, still remembers. And maybe that's why they don't want us to know. Because once you realize what you carry, once you know you are a walking piece of prehistory, you can no longer be controlled by someone else's narrative. You no longer see yourself as a product of oppression. You see yourself as a descendant of greatness. Albert Perry's Y chromosome isn't just science. It's a mirror, a message, a map that points not to your weakness, but to your power. And you don't need a lab to tell you what your ancestors already knew. You were here first, so now you know. Albert Perry wasn't an accident. His DNA wasn't an anomaly. His story wasn't meant to stay hidden. It was meant to awaken something. Because this isn't just about one man from South Carolina, it's about you, your family, your bloodline, your legacy. If Albert Perry's Y chromosome could survive 338,000 years, through migrations, empires, slavery, war, erasure, and still show up in modern America, what else have we carried all this time without even knowing? They told us we were from nowhere. They told us we began in chains. They told us our story started on auction blocks, in cotton fields, in captivity. But the truth is louder than their lies. We are the beginning. We are the original architects, the navigators, the creators of language, science, and spirit. We were here before they wrote their first book, before they drew their first map, before they dared to claim discovery, and now that truth is rising, in documentaries, in DNA tests, in whispers between elders and children who are starting to ask deeper questions. So ask yourself, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you let it collect dust like another internet video, or will you let it light a fire? Because this isn't just about knowing history, it's about reclaiming identity. It's about knowing that when you walk, you carry thousands of years of memory. When you speak the language of survivors. When you breathe the same air as gods and kings whose names they tried to erase. And they tried. Oh, they tried. But you can't bury what's in the blood. You can't silence what's in the soul, and you can't kill what was here first. So to every black person watching this, you are not a descendant of slaves. You are a descendant of the original. You are the proof. You are the witness. You are the return. They may have hidden the truth, but they didn't destroy it, because it lives in you.